in the situation of the Toronto context, and then make a few reflections on what it means to do queer Palestine solidarity activism from a location like Toronto. So Queers Against Israeli Apartheid formed in 2008 and marched in the Pride Parade with a trade union that summer for the first time without too much attention other than some garbage thrown at them. But it wasn't until May 27th, 2009 that the first attempt at banning Queer from the parade occurred. So on the 27th of May, one of the newspapers in Toronto published that Queer had been banned from the parade, which was news to the group because we hadn't even applied to march in the parade. So how do you get banned when you haven't even applied to march? I don't know. It turned out they were wrong. The quick to publish Queer being banned from the parade actually mobilized Queer and its supporters to march for the first time in his own contingent in the Pride Parade that summer. Following the 2009 parade, the attempts to ban Queer became an annual affair. So we saw lobbyists, particularly pro-Israel lobbyists, city officials, the provincial legislature in Ontario, and major funding bodies all participating in sometimes overt and other times covert, so like behind the scenes, attempts to remove Queers Against Israeli Apartheid from Toronto's Pride Parade. Some of the Toronto-based pro-Israel lobbyists, just to give you a sense of what type of lobbying efforts are driving the banning attempts, there are a couple individuals, but we're also looking at majorly funded lobby groups, such as the former Canadian Jewish Congress, which is now called the Canadian Council for Israel and Jewish Affairs, or Advocacy, B'nai B'rith Canada, the Simon Wiesenthal Center, and even the Jewish Defense League, which, for those of you who know, in the United States is actually listed as a terrorist organization. So on May 21st, 2010, the words Israeli apartheid were in fact banned from the Pride Parade. And I want to highlight here that it wasn't the group Queers Against Israeli Apartheid that was banned from the parade, but in fact the words Israeli apartheid. And the language here, I think, is really important to think about, because the suggestion is that the queer members of Queer were welcome to march in the parade, but only as long as they changed their name and changed their messaging to not include the words Israeli apartheid. And I'm going to return to this question of language a little bit later on, so I just wanted to flag it. So in the coming minutes, I guess, I'm going to be looking at a few themes. I'll be looking at the neoliberalization of queer communities and this idea of homo-nationalism that has become very popular, especially when talking about the State of Israel and its relationship to its gay PR campaign and pinkwashing. I'll be talking about Israeli nationalism in Canada a little bit, and how the terms of apartheid play out in these censorship debates. So the banning of the words Israeli apartheid is really functioned in Toronto under two guises. So the first is this idea of discomfort. And the argument that was made was that the words Israeli apartheid made people who were Israeli citizens who were living in Canada or visiting Canada for the Pride Parade, and people who were supporters of Israel, as well as, by extension, the larger Jewish community, which is the assumption that was being made. And I just also want to put a side note that that also erases the very diverse voices within the Jewish community in places like Toronto that actually are anti-Zionist. So it creates a kind of monolithic, homogenous group. And so this narrative around discomfort really, in many ways, became an extension for exclusion. And it translated the idea of being uncomfortable with language to feelings of insecurity or feeling unsafe or being unwelcome at Pride. And this slip between comfort or discomfort and exclusion is a particularly neoliberal logic that translates the narratives and claims for justice into claims for inclusion. And I'm going to go into that a little bit more shortly, but I want to talk about the second process that's happening at the same time in Toronto with the banning of the words Israeli apartheid. So the larger project in Canada around narratives around the words Israeli apartheid needs to be contextualized within a larger movement by pro-Israel lobbyists in the country who have been spending the last few years trying to condemn criticism of the State of Israel, and in particular the use of the word apartheid in order to describe the State of Israel's practices of separation, of occupation, of, et cetera. I'll get into that after. So, and that this kind of claim alleges that the term Israeli apartheid constitutes a form of hateful speech, that it becomes and is equivalent to a hate act or a form of discrimination. And this is playing out today, in fact, in the city of Toronto, as our anti-discrimination policy is being rewritten right now under the directive that they're supposed to include in the language of discrimination clauses that will allow the municipal government to exclude funding to groups or to organizations that have within them people who are using the words Israeli apartheid as part of their organizing. So that impact is far-reaching beyond the Pride Festival, but could impact all arts and culture at the city that receive municipal funding. So I think these are like important moments to flag in these kinds of shifts in narrative. So in this kind of context, I'm identifying the processes as functioning under neoliberal logics. And in particular, this idea around the discomfort of the words Israeli apartheid that replace languages of injustice and thinking about discrimination or exclusion in traditional human rights narratives changes the way that human rights are articulated. In particular, they put the question of representation and not an analysis of subjugation at the forefront of their articulations of rights discourses. And for example, in the case with Queer, the narrative is that Queer violates human rights because it makes people feel excluded, because it makes people feel like they don't belong and that they're not properly represented then in the Pride Parade because they'll be excluded from participating because they feel unsafe to attend the parade with a group that's named Queers Against Israeli Apartheid or that carries messages that are critical of the state of Israel. So these political acts and speeches against apartheid are then believed to create an uncomfortable feeling. They alienate and they exclude through this discomfort of political speech. The second thing that we see in terms of a neoliberal logic that's going on is the kind of economic logics that neoliberalism advances, and in particular around the targeting of funding structures for the Pride Parade. So it's worth noting that the pro-Israel lobbying that occurred that tried to exclude Queer from the Pride Parade centered primarily on targeting economic sources of revenue for the parade in order to pressure Pride to ban Queer on the first hand, and then secondly, publicly blame Queer for any defunding that would happen of the Pride Parade. So this occurred by lobbying private donors, corporate sponsors, and public funding. And in fact, our very own mayor, Rob Ford, who was just removed from office last week. I can see there's lots of Toronto people or Canadians around. Used Queer's participation in the parade as a pretense to try and defund Pride, because he's actually homophobic. So these are some of the logics that are circulating around the efforts to have Queer banned, and in particular, the anxieties that circulated around the use of the words Israeli apartheid and the pressure from Pride to have Queer change its message and language. So I'm going to talk a little bit about pinkwashing and homo-nationalism, and as Ramsey so articulately put it, I'll just kind of briefly go into it and not describe it in too much detail. But pinkwashing kind of is used as an arsenal for kind of pro-Israel lobbying in defense of Israel within spaces like Pride in Toronto. So it also functions in Canadian context. So pinkwashing as a tactic outside of the Israeli state context, outside of brand Israel, through things like the Canadian government's military plans or foreign policies, immigration policies and deportations. And I have lots of stories that I could tell about other practices that the Canadian government actively engages in pinkwashing within our own borders, as well as participates in supporting Israeli forms of pinkwashing within Canada. Oh God. All right. Pinkwashing. Pinkwashing is then a tactic of using gay rights to divert attention away from the violation of human rights. And in this case, pinkwashing is kind of a practice as part of a larger system of what people are calling now homo-nationalism, which is this kind of inclusion of sexual citizens, like gay Canadian citizens or gay citizens of Israel who are kind of just normal people who get married and serve in the military. So the inclusion of these people in exchange for this inclusion, the state then gets to deploy these people as evidence of the state's liberal democratic status. So what happens to these kind of people, these homo-nationals, when it comes to Toronto Pride? Well, they actually take a really active role. So these people end up playing a role in positioning themselves as neutral arbiters. So like they act as judges that are considered to be neutral in defense of the state and self-representing the state's interests in this threat that Queer poses by bringing politics, and in particular Palestine politics, to the Pride Parade. So therefore the claim is that Pride would no longer be a celebration for sexual diversity if sexuality is coupled with rights claims. By making it political, we're diverting and taking attention away from the importance and centrality of sexual rights. So despite the attempts to ban Queer, the right-wing co-option of struggles and diversity narratives, this stuff didn't actually sit well with Toronto queers, particularly because of a strong history of anti-censorship. And so because of these kind of liberal notions around freedom of expression, this allowed Queer to really develop a strange kind of coalition with people that we normally hadn't been in solidarity with in order to march in the parade, but also to be able to have the right within the context of Pride to articulate critical messages of the State of Israel, the words Israeli apartheid, and Palestine solidarity messaging. So joining this kind of free speech coalition, I'm sorry, I keep pouting every time I get a minute update. So joining a free speech coalition, Queer then both mobilized liberal rights discourses strategically in these moments and defended against the co-option of these kinds of rights into neoliberal, pro-Israel, and right-wing attempts to censor the words Israeli apartheid. And so on the one hand, this kind of in-between place of Queer meant that Queer was disrupting the kind of inclusion narratives that called on activists to censor political speech in order to make space for people to feel comfortable, and to resist the call from liberals and neoliberals to reveal an out Palestinian queer to act as a placeholder for inclusion and visibility in the narrative of the representation model of diversity within the Pride Parade. And so here the idea is that they would like to see Israeli queers and Palestinian queers marching in the parade so that there's equal visibility, which erases the conditions of apartheid that are at play. And then on the other hand, Queer, was fighting for inclusion for its own messaging within the parade, which is a kind of ironic position to be in some ways. So I'll end at that. There's a lot more, but sorry, thanks.